Some say the deepest wounds never truly heal. They just learn to live quietly in the corners of a man's heart. For 12 winters, Silas McCoy had carried such a wound, speaking his dead wife's name only to the mountain wind that howled through the Colorado peaks. The mountain man had made his peace with loneliness until a blizzard brought him something he never expected. A half-frozen schoolteacher named Abigail Rivers appeared at his cabin door, and suddenly everything changed. This is the story of how love found 2 broken souls in the wilderness and gave them a second chance at happiness. But can a grieving widower learn to open his heart again when the scars run so deep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies when Silas McCoy stepped onto his cabin porch, breath forming white clouds in the bitter morning air. At 43, his weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long ago learned that survival depended on routine. The same routine he had followed for 12 winters, ever since Sarah's grave had been covered by the first snowfall of 1835. He pulled his woolen coat tighter and reached instinctively for the chain around his neck, feeling the familiar weight of Sarah's wedding ring against his chest. The simple gold band had grown warm from his body heat, a constant reminder of the woman who had once made this isolated cabin feel like the center of the world. Now it felt like what it was, a wooden box perched on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by peaks that touched the sky and valleys that swallowed sound. Silas's fingers traced the worn leather binding of the Bible that sat on the rough-hewn table beside his coffee cup. Sarah's Bible, filled with her careful handwriting in the margins and pressed wildflowers that had long since turned to dust between the pages. She had read to him from it every evening by the fire, her gentle voice making even the harsh lessons of the Old Testament sound like lullabies. He hadn't opened it since the day he buried her, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away either. The cabin itself bore witness to their former happiness. Every log had been cut and fitted by his own hands, every piece of furniture crafted during the early days of their marriage, when the future seemed as endless as the mountain sky. The stone hearth they had built together still dominated the main room, its blackened stones remembering countless evenings when Sarah would sit in her rocking chair, mending clothes or planning lessons for the children she hoped to have someday. Those children never came. 3 times Sarah had carried his child, and 3 times the mountain winter had claimed what spring might have brought. The last time had taken Sarah too, her life bleeding away during a blizzard so fierce that he couldn't even fetch the doctor from the valley settlement 40 miles away. He had held her hand as she slipped away, promising he would join her when his time came, never imagining he would have to honor that vow by living. The rocking chair still sat by the fire, exactly as she had left it. Sometimes, in the shifting light of evening flames, Silas could almost see her there, her dark hair catching the glow, her hands busy with some small task. But the illusion never lasted, and he had learned to look away before the emptiness could cut too deep. His days followed the same pattern they had for over a decade. Check the traps, split wood, tend to his small cache of supplies, read the weather. In the movement of clouds across the peaks, hunt when necessary. Speak to no one except the wind, which carried his words away without judgment or response. He had become part of the mountain itself, as permanent and silent as the granite faces that surrounded him, but 50 miles away, following a barely visible trail through the same peaks that had been Silas's sanctuary. Another soul was fighting a different kind of battle with the wilderness. Abigail Rivers pulled her thin cloak tighter around her shoulders and urged her weary horse forward through the deepening snow. At 28, she possessed the kind of determined strength that came not from privilege, but from necessity. Her dark eyes, bright with intelligence despite her exhaustion, swept the treacherous path ahead while her mind calculated distances and dangers with the precision of someone who had learned that survival often depended on careful planning. The teaching position in the valley settlement of Cedar Falls had seemed like a gift from Providence when she had received the letter 3 weeks ago. After the scandal in Denver, though she knew it hadn't been a scandal at all, merely the desperate flight of a woman who refused to be sold like livestock, she had needed somewhere remote enough that her past couldn't follow. The opportunity to teach children on the frontier had appealed to both her sense of purpose and her need for escape. Her leather satchel, secured carefully behind her saddle, contained everything she owned in the world. A few changes of clothes, her teaching supplies, the letters of recommendation she had carefully forged, and the small bundle of money she had managed to save from her previous positions. It wasn't much, but it represented freedom, something she had never known in her 28 years of life. The wind had been growing stronger throughout the day, and now it carried a bite that spoke of serious weather approaching. Abigail had grown up in the cities of the East, where storms meant staying indoors with warm fires and hot meals. She was learning too late that mountain weather was an entirely different creature. The snow that had begun as scattered flakes an hour ago now fell with purpose, gathering in the folds of her cloak and on her horse's mane. She consulted the crude map the last settlement had provided, but the landmarks meant nothing in this white wilderness. Every ridge looked the same, every stand of pine trees blended into the next. The trail, if it could even be called that, had disappeared beneath the snow, leaving her to navigate by instinct and hope. Her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Prudence, stumbled slightly on the icy ground. The animal's breathing was labored, white puffs of vapor forming around her nostrils. They had been climbing steadily for hours, and both rider and mount were reaching the limits of their endurance. "Easy, girl," Abigail whispered, leaning forward to stroke Prudence's neck. "We'll find shelter soon." But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. The storm was intensifying with each passing minute, and the temperature was dropping fast. The wind now howled through the trees with a voice that seemed to mock her city-bred confidence. She had read about mountain blizzards in books, but no words could have prepared her for the reality of being caught in one. As if responding to her growing fear, the storm unleashed its full fury. The wind shifted from howl to shriek, driving snow horizontally across the trail and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Prudence stopped altogether, her head lowered against the assault, unwilling to take another step into the white wall before them. Abigail's hands had gone numb despite her gloves, and her feet in their city-made boots felt like blocks of ice. She tried to remember the advice the old trapper at the last settlement had given her about reading weather signs, but her mind felt as frozen as her fingers. All she knew was that staying in the open meant death, and moving forward might mean the same thing. Through the screaming wind, she thought she caught a glimpse of something dark against the white, a shape too regular to be natural. Her heart leaped with desperate hope as she urged Prudence forward, praying it wasn't just another cruel trick of the storm. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the blessed sight of a log cabin, smoke rising from its chimney like a gray prayer against the white sky. Light glowed warm and yellow in its windows, speaking of fire and shelter and the possibility of living through the night. Abigail slid from Prudence's back on legs that could barely hold her weight. Her vision was starting to blur around the edges, and she knew that hypothermia was beginning to claim her. With the last of her strength, she led the horse toward what looked like a small stable attached to the cabin. The wind grabbed at her cloak and nearly knocked her down as she struggled to secure Prudence. Her fingers fumbled with the simple task of removing the saddle, and she had to stop twice to rest against the horse's warm flank. Everything seemed to be happening through a strange, dreamy haze, and she realized dimly that this was dangerous, that her body was beginning to shut down. Somehow, she managed to stumble from the stable to the cabin's front door. Her numb fist struck the heavy wood 3 times before her strength gave out entirely. She leaned against the doorframe, her last conscious thought a prayer to whatever power watched over foolish city girls who ventured into mountain storms. Inside the cabin, Silas McCoy looked up from his evening meal, certain that the sound he had heard was just another trick of the wind. Silas set down his spoon and listened. The wind had been howling for the better part of an hour, but something in that last sound had been different, more deliberate. He rose from the table, his hand automatically checking the rifle that hung above the fireplace. In 12 years of solitude, he had learned to trust his instincts about sounds that didn't belong. He moved to the window and peered through the thick glass, seeing nothing but the white fury of the storm. The snow was falling, so heavily now that his own woodpile, barely 20 feet from the cabin, had disappeared into the swirling darkness. Whatever had made that sound was either very close or very loud. The sound came again. 3 distinct impacts against his front door. Silas grabbed his coat and the rifle, though he couldn't imagine what kind of fool would be traveling in weather like this. Bears were denned up for the winter, and even the most desperate outlaw would have sense enough to find shelter before attempting anything in a blizzard. Still, 12 years of isolation had taught him caution above all else. He lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open, immediately regretting the decision as the wind drove snow into his face and threatened to tear the door from his grasp. At first, he saw nothing but the storm. Then his eyes dropped, and his heart stopped. A woman lay crumpled against his doorframe, her dark cloak dusted with snow, her face pale as the drifts around her. For one terrible moment, time folded back on itself, and he saw Sarah lying in their bed, the life draining from her cheeks while he stood helpless. But this woman's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her eyelids fluttered as the warmth from his cabin touched her face. Silas slung the rifle over his shoulder and bent to gather the stranger in his arms. She was lighter than he had expected, her body slack with unconsciousness, but still alive. As he lifted her, her teaching satchel slipped from her shoulder and would have fallen into the snow if he hadn't caught it with his free hand. Even in her unconscious state, she seemed to cling to it. He kicked the door shut behind him and carried her to the fireplace, laying her gently on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth. In the warm yellow light, he could see her more clearly. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair that had escaped from whatever arrangement she had worn it in. Her clothes, though well made, were soaked through and inadequate for mountain weather. City clothes, he realized. This woman had no business being on his mountain in the middle of winter. Her lips had a blue tinge that spoke of serious cold exposure, and her breathing was too shallow for his liking. Silas had seen enough men die of hypothermia to recognize the signs. He needed to get her warm and quickly. Working with the efficiency born of necessity, he began stripping away her wet outer garments. Her cloak was frozen stiff in places, and her leather boots were caked with ice. Underneath, her dress was damp but not soaked through, which probably meant the difference between life and death. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find, and built up the fire until it roared like a living thing. For the next hour he watched over her, as he once had over Sarah during her final illness, monitoring her breathing and checking her pulse at regular intervals. Gradually, color began to return to her cheeks, and her breathing deepened. When her eyes finally opened, they were the darkest brown he had ever seen, bright with intelligence despite her ordeal. She tried to sit up immediately, then winced and fell back against the makeshift bed he had created for her. "Easy," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You've been unconscious for over an hour. Your body needs time to remember how to work properly." Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rustic furniture, the rifle above the fireplace, and finally settling on Silas himself. He saw wariness there, but also gratitude. "My horse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Prudence, I left her in your stable." "She's fine," Silas assured her. "Rubbed down and fed. She's probably warmer than she's been in days." Relief flooded her features, and she closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you. I thought we were both gonna die out there." "You nearly did." Silas moved to the stove and ladled hot broth from the pot he kept simmering there. "Can you sit up enough to drink this?" She nodded and struggled to push herself upright. Silas hesitated for a moment, then moved to help her, his hands carefully supporting her shoulders as she settled back against the pile of furs and blankets. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. He hadn't touched another human being. In 12 years, she accepted the cup of broth gratefully, wrapping her hands around it as much for warmth as for sustenance. The first sip made her sigh with relief. "I'm Abigail Rivers," she said between careful sips. "I was traveling to Cedar Falls to take a teaching position, but I'm afraid I've gotten rather badly lost." "Silas McCoy," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "And you're not lost. You're about as found as anyone can be on this mountain. Problem is, Cedar Falls is still 40 miles south of here, and this storm's likely to last for days." Abigail's face fell. "Days? But I'm expected at the school. The children will have to wait," Silas said bluntly. "Nobody's traveling anywhere until this weather breaks. That trail you were following becomes a death trap in conditions like this." She studied his face in the firelight, and Silas found himself wondering what she saw there. A wild man who had forgotten how to live among civilized people. A hermit whose only conversations were with the wind. He supposed both were true enough. "I don't wish to impose," Abigail said carefully. "Perhaps when the storm passes I could continue on my way." Silas almost laughed, but it came out as more of a grunt. "Miss Rivers, take a look outside that window when daylight comes. We're at 8,000 feet above sea level. It's the middle of February, and this storm has all the makings of one that could last a week. You're not imposing. You're surviving." The bluntness of his words seemed to sink in, and Abigail's composure wavered slightly. She had clearly expected to reach her destination and begin her new life, not find herself trapped in a cabin with a stranger who looked like he could wrestle bears for entertainment. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, perhaps seeking some reassurance that he was civilized despite appearances. 12 years, Silas replied, then added reluctantly, "My wife and I built this place together. She died the winter of 1835. Something in his tone warned against further questions, and Abigail had the wisdom to heed it. Instead, she finished her broth and handed back the empty cup. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. McCoy. I hope I won't be too much trouble." Silas took the cup and set it aside, then moved to check the storm's progress through the window. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was driving snow horizontally past the glass, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that he could feel it through the thick cabin walls. "You'll sleep by the fire tonight," he said without turning around. "I'll take the loft. Tomorrow we'll see about finding you some clothes that won't get you killed if you have to go outside." Abigail looked down at her city dress and seemed to realize for the first time how inadequate her preparations had been. "I'm afraid I didn't quite understand what mountain travel would entail." "Most people don't," Silas said. He moved to bank the fire for the night, adding logs that would burn slowly and keep the cabin warm until morning. "The mountains don't care about your intentions or your schedule. They'll kill you just as dead, whether you're a saint or a sinner." There was something almost comforting about his matter-of-fact approach to danger, Abigail thought. No false reassurances or polite pretenses, just the truth, spoken plainly by a man who had clearly learned it the hard way. As Silas climbed the ladder to the small loft where he slept, Abigail settled deeper into the nest of blankets by the fire. The storm continued to rage outside, but for the first time in days, she felt safe. Whatever else Silas McCoy might be, he was clearly a man who knew how to survive in this harsh country. And for now, that was enough. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind howling around the cabin, no longer the voice of death, but simply weather that would eventually pass. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was alive and warm, and that was more than she had dared hope for just a few hours ago. In the loft above, Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of another person's presence in his sanctuary for the first time in 12 years. The sound of her breathing, the small movements she made settling into sleep, the simple fact that someone else shared the space Sarah had once filled, it all felt like a betrayal of the life he had built around her memory. But as the storm raged on and the hours passed, Silas found himself listening to those sounds with something that wasn't quite loneliness anymore, though he couldn't yet name what had taken its place. Dawn came grey and muted, filtered through the continuing snowfall that showed no signs of relenting. Silas woke to the unfamiliar sound of another person stirring below, and for a disorienting moment, he forgot where and when he was. The soft rustle of blankets, the quiet sigh of someone waking, the subtle presence of another soul in his space transported him back to mornings with Sarah when the world had been full of possibility instead of mere survival. Reality returned quickly. Enough. He climbed down from the loft to find Abigail sitting up by the dying fire, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders. She had folded the blankets neatly and was studying the cabin with curious eyes, taking in details she had been too exhausted to notice the night before. "Good morning," she said softly, as if unsure whether conversation was welcome. Silas grunted a response and moved to build up the fire. Outside, the storm continued with undiminished fury, the wind driving snow against the windows in waves. He had seen enough mountain weather to know this was the kind of storm that redrew maps, burying trails and landmarks under drifts that might not melt until late spring. "How long do these typically last?" Abigail asked, following his gaze to the window. "This one?" Silas considered the grey sky and the particular way the wind was behaving. 3 days minimum. Could be a week. He saw her absorb this information with the kind of careful composure that spoke of a woman accustomed to adapting to circumstances beyond her control. No tears, no protests about her schedule or her obligations, just acceptance of what was. "Then I suppose I should make myself useful," she said, rising from her makeshift bed. "What needs doing?" The question caught him off guard. In 12 years of solitude, no one had asked what needed doing. He did what needed doing when it needed doing, without consultation or assistance. The very concept of shared labor felt foreign. "You need proper clothes first," he said finally. "What you're wearing won't keep you alive if you have to go outside." Silas moved to a cedar chest in the far corner of the cabin, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and lavender, were Sarah's winter clothes. Woolen, skirts and thick stockings, flannel undergarments and sturdy boots lined with rabbit fur. Everything a mountain woman needed to survive the harsh seasons. His hands hesitated over the fabric. These clothes still held the faint scent of the woman who had worn them, still carried the shape of her body in their folds. Giving them to a stranger felt like another small death, another step away from the life he had shared with Sarah. But practicality overrode sentiment. Abigail needed warm clothes, and these would save her life if she had to venture outside. He pulled out a complete outfit and carried it to where she sat. "These were my wife's," he said simply. "They'll fit you better than anything of mine." Abigail accepted the bundle with careful hands, her fingers tracing the quality of the wool. "Are you certain? These are clearly—" "She's been gone 12 years, Silas cut her off. "They're just clothes now." But they both knew that wasn't quite true. As Abigail retreated to the small alcove that served as a dressing area, Silas found himself remembering Sarah's careful hands mending these same garments, her quiet humming as she worked by the fire in the evenings. The memories came without invitation and stayed without welcome. When Abigail emerged, transformed from city woman to someone who might actually survive on the mountain, Silas felt an unexpected jolt. The clothes fit her well. She and Sarah had been similar in build, But where Sarah had moved with the easy confidence of someone born to mountain life, Abigail carried herself with the careful grace of someone still learning the rules of survival. "Much better," he said, and meant it. "Now you look like someone who might live through winter." Over the next several hours, Silas found himself in the strange position of teaching another person the basics of mountain survival. He showed her how to read the fire, adding logs at precise intervals to maintain steady heat without wasting fuel. He demonstrated the art of melting snow for water without wasting precious firewood, and explained why certain types of snow were better than others. Abigail proved to be an attentive student, asking practical questions and remembering his answers. She had clearly been educated. Her speech and mannerisms spoke of learning and refinement, but she applied that intelligence to her immediate circumstances without complaint or false delicacy. "Why did you choose to live so far from everyone else?" she asked as they worked together to prepare the midday meal. The question was natural enough, but it struck at the heart of everything Silas had spent 12 years avoiding. He considered deflecting it, giving her some simplified answer about preferring solitude. Instead, he found himself speaking more truth than he had intended. "I didn't choose it at first," he said, stirring a pot of stew. "Sarah and I came up here because we wanted to build something together, away from the noise and corruption of the settlements. After she died, leaving felt like abandoning her memory. Staying felt like the only way to keep faith with what we had built." Abigail absorbed this thoughtfully. "And now it's just habit," Silas said, though he suspected that wasn't entirely true anymore. Man gets set in his ways after a while. They ate their simple meal in comfortable silence, the storm providing a constant backdrop of wind and driving snow. Silas found himself studying his unexpected guest when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something about her that didn't quite add up. Her clothes had been expensive, despite their inadequacy for mountain travel, and her mannerisms spoke of a refined upbringing that seemed at odds with a schoolteacher's usual circumstances. "What brought you to teaching?" he asked as they cleaned up after their meal. A shadow crossed Abigail's face, so quickly he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. "I've always loved learning," she said, "and I'm good with children. It seemed like honest work." It was a careful answer, he realized. True as far as it went, but not the whole truth. Everyone who ended up on the frontier was running from something, and Silas had learned not to press too hard for details. People would share their stories when they were ready, or they wouldn't. Either way was fine with him. Late in the afternoon, as they sat by the fire sharing the simple tasks of daily maintenance, he sharpened his hunting knife while she mended. A small tear in one of the borrowed garments, a sound from outside, made them both freeze. It was a howl, long and mournful, carried on the wind. Then another, and another, until the air was filled with the voices of a pack calling to each other. Through the storm, "Wolves," Silas said quietly, rising to check that the cabin door was properly secured. "They're moving closer to shelter, same as everything else." Abigail had gone pale at the sound. "Are we safe in here?" "Safe enough," Silas assured her. "Wolves don't usually bother with humans unless they're desperate, and there's still plenty of game for them higher up. But it's something to keep in mind." He moved to the window and peered out into the swirling snow. The howls seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, suggesting a good-sized pack. In normal weather, they would stay well away from human habitation, but these weren't normal conditions, and desperate animals made different choices than well-fed ones. "How many would be in a pack like that?" Abigail asked, joining him at the window. 8 to 12, most likely. Maybe more. Silas checked his rifle automatically. "They're probably just passing through, looking for deer-driven, down from the higher elevations by the storm." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Silas felt the familiar prickle of caution that had kept him alive through 12 mountain winters. The wolves might be just passing through, or they might decide that a warm cabin was worth investigating. Either way, it was another reminder that survival on the mountain required constant vigilance. As evening settled over the cabin and the storm continued to rage outside, Silas found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the wind. And for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't just protecting his own life. The realization sat strangely with him, like a responsibility he had forgotten how to carry. The second night passed without incident, though Silas woke several times to the distant sound of howls echoing through the mountain valleys. By morning, the storm had begun to exhaust itself, the wind dropping from a shriek to a steady moan, and the snow falling in smaller, less urgent flakes. Abigail had risen before him, a fact that both surprised and unsettled Silas. He found her, sitting in Sarah's rocking chair, reading from the leather-bound Bible that had sat untouched on his table for 12 years. The sight stopped him cold at the bottom of the loft ladder. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking up from the worn pages. "I couldn't sleep, and I noticed this lying open." The Bible hadn't been lying open. Silas was certain of that. He kept it closed, spine facing away from the room, positioned exactly as Sarah had left it on that last morning. But now it lay open in Abigail's lap, and she was reading from what looked like the Book of Ruth. "There are such beautiful notes in the margins," Abigail continued, seemingly unaware of his discomfort. "Your wife must have been a woman of deep faith." "She was," Silas managed, his voice rougher than usual. He moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, needing something to do with his hands, while he processed the strange violation he felt at seeing another woman reading Sarah's private thoughts. "This passage is underlined," Abigail said softly, "where Ruth says, 'Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.' It's one of my favorites as well." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He remembered Sarah reading that same passage aloud during their first winter together, when the isolation had seemed overwhelming and the future uncertain. She had said it was about more than marriage. It was about choosing to build a life with someone, no matter how difficult the circumstances. "She read it to me once," he said, not turning from the stove. "Said it reminded her why she had chosen to come up here with me." Abigail closed the Bible carefully and returned it to its place on the table. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed. Sometimes when I can't sleep, reading helps quiet my thoughts." "What keeps you awake?" Silas asked, surprising himself with the question. He wasn't usually one for probing into other people's troubles. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. She rose from the rocking chair and moved to help him with breakfast preparations, her movements graceful in the borrowed clothes that had once belonged to his wife. "I suppose I'm worried about what comes next," she said finally. "I've made so many plans, and now they're all disrupted. It makes me wonder if I'm being foolish, trying to build a new life in a place I know nothing about." "Why did you need a new life?" Silas asked, his directness cutting through her careful evasions. "Woman with your education and manners could find work anywhere. Why come to the middle of nowhere to teach children who might not even want to learn?" Abigail's hands stilled on the coffee pot. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. "Because sometimes a person needs to disappear," she said quietly, "and remote places are good for that." The honesty in her answer resonated with something deep in Silas's chest. He had spent 12 years disappearing himself, though his reasons were different from hers. Still, he recognized the look in her eyes, the careful wariness of someone who had learned that running away sometimes meant running toward the only safety available. "What are you running from?" he asked. "A life that was chosen for me instead." "Of by me," Abigail replied. "And you, what are you running from up here?" "The world that kept going after mine stopped," Silas said simply. They looked at each other across the small cabin, two people who had found refuge in isolation for vastly different reasons. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. The spell was broken by a sound from outside, not the howling of wolves this time, but something scratching at the cabin door. Silas grabbed his rifle and moved cautiously to investigate, motioning for Abigail to stay back. Through the thick glass of the window, he could see a large, dark shape moving near the door. His first thought was bear, but it was the wrong time of year for that. As he watched, the shape resolved itself into something far less threatening, but equally unexpected. "I'll be damned," he muttered, setting the rifle aside and opening the door. A massive dog pushed its way into the cabin, shaking snow from its thick coat and looking around with bright, intelligent eyes. It was some mix of wolf and domestic breed, with the size and bearing of an animal that had learned to survive on its own. A leather collar around its neck suggested it had once belonged to someone, though how it had ended up on Silas's mountain was anyone's guess. "Hello there," Abigail said softly, extending her hand toward the animal. To Silas's surprise, the dog approached her without fear, allowing her to scratch behind its ears. "Where did you come from, I wonder? Probably got separated from some travelers by the storm," Silas said, closing the door against the cold. "Happens sometimes. Animals are smarter than people about finding shelter." The dog was clearly exhausted and hungry. Silas found some jerky and a bowl of water, which the animal accepted gratefully before settling by the fire as if it had always belonged there. "We can't keep him," Silas said, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to state it so firmly. "Of course not," Abigail agreed, but she was already stroking the dog's head with a gentle hand. "Though I suppose we can't turn him out in this weather either." The dog's presence changed the dynamic in the cabin in ways Silas couldn't quite articulate. The animal served as a buffer between two people who were still learning to navigate. Each other's company and its obvious contentment made the space feel more like a home and less like a temporary shelter. That afternoon, as the storm finally began to clear, Silas found himself teaching Abigail more complex survival skills. He showed her how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to identify which trees would provide the best firewood, and how to move quietly through the forest without alerting game or predators. She was a quick learner, he had to admit. Her city upbringing hadn't prepared her for mountain life, but her intelligence and determination more than made up for her lack of experience. There was something deeply satisfying about watching her master each new skill, seeing the confidence grow in her movements as she adapted to this harsh environment. "You're a natural at this," he told her, as she successfully identified the tracks of a deer in the snow near the cabin. "I had a good teacher," she replied, and the simple compliment warmed him in ways he hadn't expected. That evening, as they sat by the fire with the dog sprawled contentedly between them, Abigail asked the question Silas had been dreading. "When the weather clears enough for travel, what then? Do I continue to Cedar Falls? Or the trail to Cedar Falls will be impassable?" "For weeks," Silas interrupted. "Maybe months, depending on how much snow this storm dumps. You couldn't make it alone even with good weather." "Then I'm stranded here," Abigail said, and he couldn't tell from her tone whether she considered that a tragedy or a relief. "Until spring, most likely," Silas confirmed. "Question is whether you can stand being trapped up here with an old hermit for that long." Abigail looked around the cabin, taking in the rough furniture, the simple but functional layout, the warm glow of firelight on log walls. Her gaze lingered on Sarah's rocking chair, the Bible on the table, and finally on Silas himself. "I think," she said carefully, "that might depend on whether the hermit can stand being trapped up here with a city woman who doesn't know the first thing about mountain living." "You're learning fast enough," Silas said gruffly. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but it no longer sounded like the voice of death. It sounded like weather, harsh and dangerous but temporary. Something that could be waited out, survived, even shared with the right companion. By the fourth day, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin walls, and the familiar Landscape had been sculpted into new shapes that would have been beautiful if they weren't so treacherous. Silas spent the morning digging out pathways to the stable and woodshed, while Abigail tended the fire and prepared a more elaborate meal than their simple survival rations. The dog, whom Abigail had taken to calling Scout, proved his worth by alerting them to the approach of the wolf pack before either human would have noticed. His low growl brought Silas to the window in time to see several grey shapes moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Stay inside and keep Scout quiet," Silas instructed, taking down his rifle. "They're just curious, but no sense taking chances." Through the window, Abigail watched Silas step onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not aimed. The wolves had emerged from the tree line. 7 of them, she counted, led by a magnificent female with silver-tipped fur. They regarded the man on the porch with the calculating intelligence of predators assessing a potential threat. What happened next surprised her. Silas didn't shout or fire warning shots. Instead, he simply stood his ground, meeting the lead wolf's gaze directly. It was a contest of wills played out in absolute silence, predator recognizing predator across the species divide. After what felt like an eternity, the female wolf turned and trotted back toward the trees, her pack following in. Single file, they disappeared into the forest as silently as they had emerged, leaving only their tracks in the snow to prove they had been there at all. "How did you know they wouldn't attack?" Abigail asked when Silas returned inside. "I didn't," he replied, hanging the rifle back in its place, "but running or showing fear would have been worse. Sometimes the best defense is just proving you're not easy prey." The encounter had shaken Abigail more than she cared to admit. In her sheltered city life, danger had been a theoretical concept, something that happened to other people in other places. Here, death wore fur and fangs, and could appear without warning at any moment. The realization of how completely she depended on Silas's knowledge and protection was both humbling and frightening. That afternoon, Silas began teaching her to shoot. They set up targets in the clearing behind the cabin, and he patiently corrected her stance, her grip, her breathing. The rifle was heavier than she had expected, and the recoil startled her. The first few times she fired, but gradually she began to hit what she was aiming at. "Not bad for a city girl," Silas said, as her shot splintered the center of a piece of bark 20 yards away. "Keep practicing, and you might actually be able to defend yourself if something happens to me." The casual way he mentioned his potential, death sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She was beginning to realize how much her survival depended not just on his knowledge, but on his continued presence. The thought of being alone on this mountain, even with everything he had taught her, was terrifying. "Nothing's going to happen." "To you," she said firmly, as if she could make it true by saying it. Silas looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Miss Rivers, I've been living on borrowed time for 12 years. Every morning I wake up is a gift I didn't expect to receive. You can't depend on me being here forever. Then I'll just have to learn everything you can teach me," she replied, with a determination that surprised them both. That evening, as they worked together preparing and preserving meat from a deer Silas had taken that morning, Abigail found herself studying the man beside her. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, wasting nothing, missing no detail that could mean the difference between surviving winter and starving before spring. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the simple tasks of survival had become a form of prayer. "Tell me about her," Abigail said quietly. "Your wife." Silas's hands stilled on the knife he was using to slice meat for drying. For a moment, Abigail thought he wouldn't answer, that she had pushed too far into territory he kept locked away. "Sarah was—" he began, then stopped, started again. She was the kind of person who could find beauty in anything. A sunset, a bird song, the way snow fell on pine branches. She made this place feel like paradise instead of exile. His voice carried a weight of longing that made Abigail's chest ache in sympathy. She had never loved anyone with that kind of depth, had never been loved that way in return. The arranged marriage she had fled had been a business transaction, nothing more. "She sounds wonderful," Abigail said softly. She was. Silas resumed his work, but his movements had lost their earlier precision. Smart, brave, kind. Never complained. "Not even when the isolation got so bad. I thought we might both go mad from it. She just adapted. Made the best of whatever circumstances we faced." There was something in his tone that made Abigail look up from her own work. "You blame yourself for her death." It wasn't a question, and Silas didn't deny it. "I brought her up here, away from doctors, from help, from everything that might have saved her when the complications set in. She died because I was too proud to live among civilized people, too stubborn to admit that love wasn't enough to conquer everything." "Love is never enough to conquer everything," Abigail said gently, "but it's still worth having, even if you lose it." The words hung between them in the warm cabin air, heavy with meanings neither of them was quite ready to explore. Outside, Scout barked once at some sound in the forest, then settled back into watchful silence. "What about you?" Silas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Ever been in love?" Abigail considered lying, giving him some romanticized version of her past that would be easier to hear. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "No," she said simply. "I thought I was once, when I was very young. But it turned out to be nothing more than infatuation with the idea of being chosen. Real love, the kind you had with Sarah. I've never experienced that." "Maybe you're better off," Silas said. But there was no conviction in his words. "Maybe," Abigail agreed, "or maybe I just haven't found the right person yet." They worked in comfortable silence after that, the easy rhythm of shared labor, creating its own form of intimacy. Abigail found herself acutely aware of Silas's presence beside her, the way his hands moved with such competent precision, the concentration in his weathered face, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from the fire. When their hands accidentally brushed as they reached for the same tool, the contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. She looked up to find Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then Scout whined softly from his place by the fire, breaking the spell, and they both returned to their work with perhaps more focus than the simple task required. Later that night, as Abigail lay in her nest of blankets by the fire, she found herself thinking about the stone hearth that dominated the cabin's main room. Silas had mentioned that he and Sarah had built it together, and she could see the love that had gone into its construction. Every stone had been carefully chosen and fitted, creating something that would last for generations. She wondered what it would be like to build something that permanent with another person, to create a foundation solid enough to support a lifetime of shared dreams. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, especially when her imagination insisted on casting Silas in the role of partner. From the loft above, she could hear the soft sounds of Silas preparing for sleep, and she found herself wondering if he was thinking about the same things. Did he ever imagine what it might be like to love again? Or had Sarah's death closed that door forever? The questions followed her into restless dreams, where stone hearths became altars and winter storms became the backdrop for vows spoken in firelight. The next morning brought the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed major storms. The sky stretched endlessly blue above peaks that gleamed like cut diamonds, and the air was so cold it seemed to ring like a bell with each breath. Silas emerged from the cabin to find Scout standing alert at the edge of the clearing, his attention fixed on something in the distance. Following the dog's gaze, Silas spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the valley below, too far away to be a threat, but close enough to be noteworthy. Someone else had survived the storm, and they were signaling their presence to anyone who might see. "Travelers?" Abigail asked, joining him on the porch despite the bitter cold. "Most likely," Silas replied, studying the smoke's location. "Probably holed up in that old trapper's cabin about 5 miles down the ridge. Been abandoned for years, but it's still sound enough to keep someone alive through a storm. Should we check on them? See if they need help?" The question surprised Silas. In 12 years of mountain living, his first instinct had always been to avoid contact with other people. But looking at Abigail's concerned expression, he found himself considering it. She was right, of course. Civilized people helped each other, especially in conditions like these, where a moment's assistance could mean the difference between life and death. "We'll wait and see," he decided. "If they're in real trouble, they'll signal for help. Otherwise, it's best to leave people to their own business." But throughout the morning, Silas found his attention drawn repeatedly to that distant column of smoke. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The volume was wrong somehow. Too much smoke for a simple warming. Fire, but too little for a structure fire that might require assistance. By afternoon, his unease had grown strong enough that he decided to investigate. He gathered supplies for a quick reconnaissance trip, checking his rifle and filling his pack with emergency provisions. "I'll be back before dark," he told Abigail as he prepared to leave. "Keep Scout inside with you and don't open the door." "For anyone except me, you think there might be danger?" Abigail asked, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she now kept within easy reach. "I think there's always danger," Silas replied, "but probably nothing more than travelers who got caught by the storm same as you did." The journey down to the old cabin was treacherous, the fresh snow hiding rocks and deadfall that could turn an ankle or worse. But Silas knew these mountains like most people knew the rooms of their houses, and he made good time despite the conditions. What he found at the abandoned cabin confirmed his instincts. The structure was intact, and someone was definitely using it for shelter, but something felt wrong about the setup. The smoke was coming from a poorly constructed fire that was wasting fuel and producing far more visible signal than necessary. Either the occupants were inexperienced with wilderness survival, or they wanted to be found. Silas approached carefully, using his knowledge of the terrain to remain unseen while he assessed the situation. Through a gap in the cabin's chinking, he could see 3 men huddled around the wasteful fire. Their clothes marked them as city dwellers, and their conversation, when he could catch fragments of it, suggested they were searching for someone. Trail went cold after the storm. Can't have gotten far in this weather. Boss wants her found. Before the words sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They were hunting someone, and given the timing of their presence on his mountain, he had a sick feeling he knew who their quarry might be. He made his way back to his cabin with considerably more haste than he had used on the journey down, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. By the time he reached the clearing, he had made several uncomfortable connections that painted Abigail's situation in a very different light. She met him at the door, relief evident in her face. "Thank goodness you're back. I was starting to worry. We need to talk," Silas said grimly, shrugging out of his pack and hanging up his rifle. "Those travelers down in the valley, they're not lost. They're hunting someone." The color drained from Abigail's face, and Silas knew his suspicions had been correct. "What did you hear?" "Enough to know they're looking for a woman, and they're not planning to give up easily." Silas fixed her with a steady gaze. "Time to stop dancing around the truth, Miss Rivers. Who are you really? And what did you do to make someone desperate enough to chase you into these mountains?" For a long moment, Abigail stood frozen, clearly weighing her options. Then her shoulders sagged in defeat, and she sank into Sarah's rocking chair with the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "My real name is Abigail Whitmore," she said quietly. "My father died last year, leaving behind enormous debts. To save the family from complete ruin, my uncle arranged a marriage between me and Harrison Caldwell, a man whose wealth could settle our obligations and provide for my mother and younger sister. But you ran instead," Silas said, settling into the chair across from her. "Caldwell is Abigail shuddered. He's not a good man. I'd heard stories from servants, from other women. He's cruel, controlling, and he takes pleasure in breaking the spirits of those who depend on him. I wouldn't. She stopped, unable to continue, but Silas could fill in the blanks. He had seen men like that in the settlements. Men who used their power to hurt others simply because they could. So you invented Abigail Rivers and ran west, he said. I thought if I could disappear completely, find work teaching under a false name, maybe I could send money to my family without having to. She gestured helplessly. I knew it was a desperate plan, but it was the only alternative I could see to a lifetime of misery. And now Caldwell's men have tracked you here. It seems so. Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper. They must have followed my trail. From Denver, questioned people at the settlements. I thought the storm would have covered my tracks completely. Silas stood and moved to the window, studying the distant column of smoke with new understanding. They're experienced trackers then, probably hired professionals, not just Caldwell himself. The implications were sobering. Professional manhunters wouldn't give up easily, and they would be prepared for the harsh conditions that had nearly killed Abigail. Worse, they would be armed and willing to use violence to complete their job. I have to leave, Abigail said suddenly. I can't bring this trouble to your door. You've been kind enough to save my life. I won't repay that kindness by getting you killed. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? Silas asked bluntly. You barely survived one storm, and there's another system building in the west that could hit us within days. Those men down there know this country well enough to track you through snow, and they're better armed and equipped than you are. Then what do you suggest? Abigail's voice carried a note of desperation. I can't hide here forever, and I won't spend my life running from one remote settlement to another. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered peaks that had been his sanctuary for 12 years. Then he turned back to face her, his expression resolved in a way that made her breath catch. You could stay, he said simply. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. You could stay here, with me, permanently. Abigail stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Silas, I couldn't. Why not? He moved closer, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. You've proven you can adapt to mountain life. You're strong, intelligent, and you're not afraid of hard work. And if you were my wife, legally married, Caldwell would have no claim on you whatsoever. The word wife hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to process what he was suggesting. You're talking about a marriage of convenience, she said carefully. I'm talking about survival, Silas replied. Yours and mine. You need protection and a place to belong. He stopped, as if surprised by his own words. I need someone to share this life with. Someone who understands that it's not about luxury or comfort, but about building something real together. Abigail rose from the rocking chair and moved to the window, her mind reeling. The distant smoke still rose from the valley below, a visible reminder of the men who hunted her. But here in this cabin, surrounded by the tools and memories of a life built by love, she could almost imagine a different future. You loved Sarah, she said quietly. Yes, Silas replied without hesitation. And I always will, but Sarah's gone, and we're here, and maybe... His voice caught slightly. Maybe she wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life talking only to the wind. Abigail turned to face him, seeing something in his weathered features that made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. And you think you could care for me? Not as Sarah's replacement, but as myself. I think, Silas said carefully, that I already do. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything. Scout's urgent barking woke them both before dawn, and Silas was at the window with his rifle before Abigail had fully emerged from sleep. What he saw in the grey pre-dawn light made him lower his weapon in confusion rather than alarm. A horse stood in the clearing, riderless and trembling with exhaustion. The animal's coat was caked with ice, and it bore the unmistakable signs of having traveled hard through dangerous terrain. Most troubling of all, empty stirrups suggested its rider had met with misfortune somewhere on the mountain. "Stay inside," Silas instructed as he pulled on his boots and coat. "Keep Scout with you until I know what we're dealing with." The horse allowed him to approach, too exhausted to shy away from human contact. It was a fine animal, better bred, and equipped than most mountain travelers could afford. The saddle was expensive leather, well-crafted but bearing recent damage that spoke of a hard fall or desperate flight. But it was the saddlebags that made Silas's blood run cold. Inside the first, he found papers that confirmed his worst fears about the men camping in the valley below. Legal documents bearing official seals, bounty notices, and correspondence that made it clear these weren't just Caldwell's hired men. They were federal marshals with legal authority to pursue and apprehend fugitives. The second saddlebag contained something even more damaging. Detailed information about Abigail Whitmore's background, including facts that she had never shared with him. Her father hadn't just died in debt, he had been involved in a financial scandal that had ruined dozens of families. The marriage arrangement with Caldwell wasn't just about settling personal debts, but about making restitution to the people her father had defrauded. Worse yet, there were bank drafts bearing Caldwell's signature, payments to various officials, and investigators that suggested this pursuit had backing from the highest levels of territorial government. Abigail wasn't just running from an unwanted marriage. She was fleeing charges of theft and conspiracy that could see her imprisoned or worse. When Silas returned to the cabin with the saddlebags, Abigail took one look at his expression and knew that whatever he had found changed everything between them. "The horse belongs to one of the marshals," he said without preamble. "Either he's dead or he's walking back to his partners right now to report that he's found you." Abigail's face went white as she recognized the saddlebags. "You read the papers." "Every damned word," Silas replied grimly, "including the parts you forgot to mention when you told me your sob story about an arranged marriage." The harshness in his voice cut through Abigail like a blade. She sank into the rocking chair, her hands trembling, as she tried to find words that could bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them. "My father was a good man who made terrible choices," she began, but Silas cut her off. "Your father was a thief who stole the life savings of working families to fund his gambling debts. And when he got caught, he killed himself rather than face the consequences, leaving you to clean up his mess." The brutal summary of her family's disgrace hung in the air like a physical blow. Abigail closed her eyes, remembering the morning she had found her father in his study, the pistol still warm in his hand, and the suicide note that had revealed the full extent of his crimes. "You're right," she whispered, "about all of it. But I didn't know, not until after he was dead. The debts, the stolen money, the families he had ruined. I learned about it all when the investigators came. Caldwell's offer to marry me was the only way to make any kind of restitution. So you ran instead," Silas said, his voice flat with disappointment. "Left those families with nothing while you headed west to start fresh with a new name and a clean slate. What else could I do?" Abigail's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face. "Marry a man who would have treated me like property? Spend my life being punished for crimes I didn't commit? I know it was selfish, but I couldn't sacrifice myself for my father's sins." Silas studied the woman he had been prepared to marry just hours earlier, seeing her now through the lens of this new knowledge. The elegant mannerisms that had seemed charming now looked like the polish of privilege. The quick intelligence that had impressed him could just as easily be the cunning of someone accustomed to deception. "Everything you told me was a lie," he said quietly. "Not everything," Abigail protested. "My feelings for you, what we've built here together, that's real. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid. I wouldn't help you if I knew you were a fugitive from federal justice." The accuracy of his guess silenced her more effectively than any argument could have. They stared at each other across the cabin that had seemed like a refuge just minutes before and now felt like a trap closing around them both. The marshal. "Whose horse this is," Silas said finally. "He'll be missed by his partners. They'll come looking for him, and when they do, they'll find us." "Then I have to leave," Abigail said, rising from the chair with desperate resolve. "Right now, before they—" "Sit down," Silas commanded with enough authority to stop her mid-step. "Running blindly into the wilderness will get you killed, and probably me too if I'm fool enough to try stopping you." Abigail obeyed, but her whole body was tense with the need for flight. "Then what do we do?" Silas moved to the window and studied the clearing where the marshal's horse still stood, sides heaving with exhaustion. Somewhere out there, the man's partners were probably already organizing a search. Professional lawmen with federal authority and winter weather gear that would let them operate in conditions that would kill most people. "We have maybe 6 hours before they start looking for their missing partner," he said, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities. Maybe less if he was supposed to report in at regular intervals. 6 hours to do what? Silas turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "To decide whether I'm going to turn you over to them or help you disappear forever." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. In all her desperate calculations since leaving Denver, she had never considered the possibility that someone might actually choose to help her, despite knowing the truth about her circumstances. The idea that this man, this hermit who had already given her more kindness than she deserved, might be willing to risk his own freedom for her sake, was almost incomprehensible. "Why would you even consider helping me?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the leather-bound Bible that still sat on the table where Abigail had left it after her morning reading. "Because," he said finally, 12 years ago I made a promise to a dying woman that I would try to live a life worthy of the love she had given me. And maybe that doesn't mean just surviving up here alone until I'm too old and bitter to remember what love felt like." He looked directly at her then, and Abigail saw something in his weathered features that made her breath catch. Not just resignation or duty, but the beginning of something that looked almost like hope. "The question is," Silas continued, "can you live with yourself if more innocent people suffer because you chose freedom over justice?" It was the question that had haunted Abigail's dreams since the day she fled Denver, and now it stood between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Outside, the marshal's horse whickered softly, a sound that seemed to count down the minutes they had left before the decision would be made for them. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours, though the pale morning light creeping through the windows suggested that only minutes had passed. Abigail sat frozen in the rocking chair, paralyzed by the weight of Silas's question and the impossible choice it represented. Outside, the marshal's horse had begun to graze on the dried grass that poked through the snow, a mundane sight that seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. "I've thought about those families every day since I left Denver," Abigail said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know their names, their faces from the newspaper articles. The Hendersons lost their farm. Mrs. Patterson couldn't afford her son's medical treatments. The Kellys had to pull their children out of school because they couldn't pay the fees." Silas listened without comment, his weathered hands moving methodically as he began gathering supplies: rope, his hunting knife, ammunition for the rifle. The sight of these preparations sent fresh terror through Abigail, though she couldn't tell whether he was preparing to help her escape or to turn her over to the marshals. "I told myself that marrying Caldwell wouldn't really help them," she continued, desperate to fill the silence with something other than her racing thoughts. "The restitution payments would have been spread across so many victims that each family would receive almost nothing. It seemed like destroying my life for a gesture that wouldn't truly help anyone." "And now?" Silas asked, pausing in his preparations to look directly at her. "Now I don't know," Abigail admitted. I thought I could build a new life out here, maybe earn enough money teaching to send something back to them anonymously. But that was before I understood what it really means to love someone, to have something worth protecting." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Silas resumed his preparations, but Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. "What you said yesterday," she ventured, "about staying here, about marriage, did you mean it?" "I meant it," Silas replied without hesitation. "But that was before I knew the whole truth. Marriage to a fugitive would make me an accessory to federal crimes. It would mean spending whatever years I have left looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when the law catches up with both of us." Abigail's heart sank, but she couldn't fault his reasoning. She had already brought enough trouble to his door. She had no right to ask him to share her burden permanently. "Then I'll go," she said, rising from the chair with shaky determination. "I'll take the marshal's horse and try to make it to California, or maybe Mexico. You can tell the others that you found me already gone when you came back from checking." "Your traps." "Sit down," Silas said firmly. "We're not done talking." The authority in his voice stopped her mid-step, and she sank back into the rocking chair, hope and fear warring in her chest. "I said marriage to a fugitive would be complicated," Silas continued. "I didn't say it was impossible." Before Abigail could respond, he moved to the cedar chest in the corner, the same chest from which he had taken Sarah's winter clothes days earlier. This time he withdrew something wrapped in tissue paper and lavender that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. It was a wedding dress, simple but beautiful, made of white wool with delicate embroidered flowers along the sleeves and neckline. The fabric was yellowed with age, but otherwise perfect, clearly preserved with loving care over the years. "Sarah wore this when we were married," Silas said quietly, holding the dress up to the light. "I made her promise to keep it, thinking maybe someday we'd have a daughter who might want it." Abigail stared at the dress, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. The gesture felt both incredibly generous and impossibly cruel, an offer of everything she had ever wanted, wrapped in the impossible circumstances that made it unattainable. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't take her place, wear her dress, pretend that what we have is anything like what you shared with her." "You're right," Silas agreed, carefully folding the dress and laying it on the table between them. "What we have is nothing like what Sarah and I shared. It's something different entirely, something built on choice rather than chance, on need rather than innocence." He moved to the window and looked out at the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "The way I see it, we have three choices. First, I can turn you over to the marshals and let federal justice take its course." Abigail nodded, though the thought made her feel sick. "Second, I can help you disappear, give you supplies and directions to get you safely out of the territory. You'd have a chance at freedom, but you'd spend the rest of your life running. And the third choice?" Silas turned from the window to face her directly. "We get married, right now, today, before the marshals arrive. A legal marriage performed by a man with authority to conduct such ceremonies in this territory." "You can perform marriages?" Abigail asked, startled by this revelation. "Been a justice of the peace for 15 years, Silas replied, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Seemed like useful qualification for someone living this far from civilization. Never had occasion to use it much, but the authorities still valid. "But that wouldn't solve anything," Abigail protested. "They'd still arrest me for the charges in Denver." "Maybe," Silas said. "Or maybe they'd find a different kind of justice. A married woman living in isolated circumstances, working to support herself and her husband, sending what money she can to help the victims of her father's crimes. That tells a different story than a runaway heiress hiding behind false identities." The possibility he was outlining began to take shape in Abigail's mind, and she could see the logic of it. Marriage would change her legal status, give her a legitimate reason for being on the mountain, and provide a framework for making genuine restitution that didn't require sacrificing herself to Caldwell's cruelty. "You'd be taking an enormous risk," she said. "If this doesn't work, if they decide to arrest us both, then we'll face whatever comes together," Silas interrupted. "Same as any married couple faces the uncertainties of life." Abigail looked at the wedding dress spread on the table, then at the man who was offering her not just escape, but redemption. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the silver in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes, and she thought she had never seen anything more beautiful than this weathered mountain man who was willing to risk everything for a woman who had brought nothing but trouble to his door. "Are you asking me to marry you, Silas McCoy?" she said softly. "I'm asking you to choose," he replied. "Choose to face the consequences of your father's actions as my wife rather than as a fugitive. Choose to build something real and lasting instead of running from shadows for the rest of your life." Abigail rose from the rocking chair and moved to stand before him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window behind him, she could see the marshal's horse still grazing peacefully, and beyond that, the snow-covered peaks that had become her sanctuary and her prison. "If I say yes," she said quietly, "I need you to understand that I love you, not as a convenient solution to my problems, not as a substitute for the life I left behind, but as the man who saved my life in more ways than I can count." Silas reached up and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness. "And I need you to understand," he replied, "that loving you doesn't mean forgetting Sarah. It means honoring what she taught me about, building a life worth living, even when that life isn't the one you originally planned." In the distance, Scout began to bark, sharp, urgent sounds that spoke of approaching danger. Through the trees at the edge of the clearing, Abigail could see movement. 3 figures on horseback, picking their way carefully through the snow toward the cabin. "The marshals," she breathed. "Then we'd better get married," Silas said, already moving toward the Bible on the table. "Quickly." There was no time for ceremony, no moment to properly process the magnitude of what they were about to do. Silas grabbed Sarah's Bible from the table, while Abigail frantically pulled Sarah's wedding dress over her borrowed clothes, her fingers shaking as she tried to work the small buttons that ran up the back. "I can't. My hands won't," she stammered, panic making her clumsy. "Here," Silas said, setting the Bible aside and moving to help her. His weathered fingers worked with surprising gentleness, fastening each button with the careful precision of a man who had once helped his wife dress for their own wedding. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they reach the clearing." The dress fit her almost perfectly, as if Sarah had somehow known that another woman might need it someday. Abigail caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, and barely recognized the wild-haired, frightened woman staring back at her. "Do we have rings?" she asked, the practical question grounding her in the moment. Silas reached for the chain around his neck, pulling Sarah's simple gold band from where it had rested against his heart for 12 years. For a moment, Abigail thought he meant to give it to her, and she began to shake her head in protest. "I can't wear her ring." "Not her ring," Silas interrupted, opening a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside lay a matching band, slightly larger, that had clearly been crafted as part of a set. "Mine. I stopped wearing it after she died, but I kept it." He slipped Sarah's ring back under his shirt, then took Abigail's left hand in his. The simple gold band slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, and despite everything, the approaching marshals, the desperate circumstances, the terror of what lay ahead, Abigail felt a moment of pure joy at the sight of it there. Outside, Scout's barking had grown more urgent. Through the window, they could see the 3 mounted figures had reached the edge of the clearing and were studying the scene before them with professional wariness. The marshal's riderless horse was clear, evidence that something had gone wrong with their colleague, and they would be prepared for trouble. "Dearly beloved," Silas began, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these mountains to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words felt surreal, spoken in the rustic cabin with danger approaching outside, but Abigail found herself hanging onto every syllable. This might be the most unconventional wedding ceremony ever performed, but it was real, and it was theirs. Do you, Silas McCoy, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Silas said, his eyes never leaving hers. Do. You, Abigail? He paused, and she saw him make the deliberate choice. Do you, Abigail Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, she whispered, meaning it more completely than she had ever meant anything in her life. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The words were barely out of his mouth when the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the clearing. The marshals had decided to approach directly, no longer concerned with stealth now that they had found what they were looking for. Kiss me, Abigail said urgently, and Silas obliged, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and promise. For one perfect moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, husband and wife, facing an uncertain future together. Then, someone pounded on the cabin door with the authority of federal law. "Open up, U.S. Marshals!" Silas straightened his shirt and checked that his rifle was within easy reach, though he made no move toward it. "Remember," he said quietly to Abigail, "you're my wife now. That changes everything about how this conversation goes." Abigail nodded, drawing strength from the unfamiliar weight of the ring on her finger. She was no longer Abigail Whitmore, fugitive from justice. She was Mrs. Silas McCoy, and that identity came with protections and possibilities that hadn't existed just moments before. Silas opened the door to reveal three grim-faced men in heavy winter coats, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The leader, a tall man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his authority respected. "I'm Marshal Thomas Garrett," he announced. "We're looking for a woman named Abigail Whitmore, wanted in connection with fraud and theft charges out of Denver. We have reason to believe she's in this area." "Can't say I know anyone by that name," Silas replied easily, his mountain man's wariness perfectly natural under the circumstances. "Though I don't get many visitors up here." Marshal Garrett's eyes moved past Silas to take in the cabin's interior, and Abigail knew the moment he spotted her standing by the fireplace in the white wedding dress. His expression sharpened with the satisfaction of a hunter who had found his quarry. "And who might this be?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "My wife," Silas said with quiet pride. "Abigail McCoy. We were just married." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife? How interesting. Would you mind if I spoke with her?" "I'd mind plenty," Silas replied, his voice hardening. "But I suppose you'll do it anyway, so might as well come inside where it's warm." There, three marshals entered the cabin, their presence immediately making the cozy space feel cramped and threatening. Marshal Garrett studied Abigail with the calculating gaze of someone comparing her to a wanted poster he had memorized. "Mrs. McCoy," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "you wouldn't happen to have been traveling under the name Abigail Rivers recently, would you?" Abigail felt the weight of three pairs of eyes studying her, looking for any sign of deception or fear that would confirm their suspicions. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet Marshal Garrett's gaze directly. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, Marshal," she said with as much composure as she could manage. "I've never traveled under any name but my own." "Your own name being Abigail McCoy, née Whitmore?" The marshal's tone was sharp with triumph. Beside her, Silas shifted slightly, and Abigail could feel the tension radiating from him. This was the moment of truth, the point where their desperate gamble would either save them or damn them both. "That's correct," she said simply, "though I'm curious how you knew my maiden name." "Because, ma'am, you're wanted for questioning in connection with your father's financial crimes." We've been tracking you across 3 territories. One of the other marshals, a younger man with suspicious eyes, spoke up. Mighty convenient timing for a wedding, don't you think? We've been chasing Abigail Whitmore for weeks, and suddenly she's Mrs. McCoy. Nothing convenient about it, Silas interjected, his voice carrying the gruff authority of a man defending his family. I've been courting Abigail through letters for months. She came up here to marry me, got caught in that storm, and we've been snowed in ever since. Soon as the weather cleared enough, we made it official. Letters? Marshal Garrett asked skeptically. From a wanted fugitive. From a woman whose father got himself into legal trouble she had nothing to do with, Silas corrected firmly. Woman has a right to marry who she chooses, doesn't she? The marshal's expression suggested he disagreed. But he was clearly trying to work out the legal implications of the situation. A married woman enjoyed certain protections under territorial law, and arresting her from her own home, especially on her wedding day, would create complications he probably preferred to avoid. Mrs. McCoy, he said finally, regardless of your current marital status, you're still wanted for questioning about your father's activities. The families he defrauded deserve answers, and justice demands that restitution be made. You're absolutely right, Abigail said, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. They do deserve answers, and restitution should be made. But I have a proposal. Marshal Garrett's eyebrows rose. I'm listening. Give me 1 year, Abigail said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. 1 year to work with my husband and earn money honestly. Every cent we can spare will go toward restitution for my father's victims. At the end of that year, I'll turn myself in to face whatever charges you deem appropriate. That's not how the law works, ma'am, the younger marshal said. You can't bargain your way out of federal charges. She's not bargaining, Silas said quietly. She's offering to do what's right on her own terms, instead of having justice imposed on her by men who don't understand the full situation. Marshal Garrett studied the couple standing before him, the mountain man who had clearly found something worth protecting, and the frightened woman who was trying to transform herself into someone worthy of that protection. Something in their bearing, the way they stood together facing an uncertain future, seemed to give him pause. What kind of work? He asked finally. Teaching, Abigail said immediately. The children in the valley settlements need education, and I'm qualified to provide it. Mountain families don't have much money, but they have goods to trade, services to barter. Over the course of a year working together, we could accumulate enough to make meaningful restitution. And at the end of that year, Abigail looked at Silas, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. At the end of that year, I'll have proven that I'm not my father. I'll have shown that I'm willing to work honestly to repair the damage he caused. If the law still demands my imprisonment, then I'll face that consequence. But at least I'll face it knowing I tried to do right by the people he hurt. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the sound of wind through the trees outside. Marshal Garrett seemed to be weighing competing considerations, his duty to enforce federal law against the practical reality of the situation before him. You understand, he said finally, that if you run, if you disappear, we'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. I understand, Abigail replied. But I won't run. This is my home now. These mountains, this man, this life we're building together, it's worth more to me than any freedom that comes from hiding. Silas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that somehow made their hastily spoken vows feel more real than all the ceremony in the world could have managed. There's one more thing, Abigail added, her voice barely above a whisper. Your missing colleague. His horse is in our clearing. We found it this morning, riderless and exhausted. I fear he may have met with an accident in the storm. Marshal Garrett's expression darkened. Where? Most likely somewhere between here and the old trapper's cabin where you've been camped, Silas said. The trail's treacherous in these conditions, especially for someone who doesn't know the mountain. We can help you search for him once we've settled this other matter. The offer of assistance seemed to tip some internal balance in the marshal's mind. He looked around the cabin once more, taking in the evidence of recent occupation, the obvious signs that two people had been genuinely weathering the storm together. 1 year, he said finally, but there will be conditions, monthly reports on your progress, verification that the money is actually reaching the victims, and if we have any reason to suspect you're planning to run, you'll have none, Abigail assured him. I give you my word as Mrs. Silas McCoy. The formal use of her new name seemed to settle something for all of them. Marshal Garrett nodded once, sharply, and moved toward the door. We'll be back in the spring to check on your progress, he warned. Don't make me regret this decision. As the three marshals prepared to leave, organizing a search for their missing colleague, Abigail felt the first real hope she had experienced since fleeing Denver months ago. The year ahead would be difficult, working to earn money while living in isolation, sending every spare cent to families who had suffered because of her father's crimes. But it was a path toward redemption rather than merely survival, and she would walk it with a partner who understood the value of building something lasting from the wreckage of the past. Spring came late to the high mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the melting of snow and the return of green to the valleys below. Abigail stood on the porch of the cabin. She now truly called home, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, the other shading her eyes as she watched her husband work in the garden they had planted together. The sight of Silas kneeling among the neat rows of vegetables, his hands dark with soil and his face peaceful in the morning sun, still had the power to take her breath away. Not because he had changed so dramatically from the grief-stricken hermit she had met in the blizzard, but because the changes had come so naturally, like a man finally allowing himself to inhabit the life he had been living all along. The beans are coming in well, he called to her, holding up a handful of tender green pods. Should have enough to trade for winter supplies and still send a good amount to the Henderson family. The mention of the Hendersons brought the familiar pang of purpose that had driven them both through the long winter months. True to their word, they had worked tirelessly to make restitution to the families her father had wronged. Abigail had taught reading and arithmetic to the children in 3 different settlements, accepting payment in goods and services that they then converted to cash and sent east. Silas had used his woodworking skills to create furniture and tools that were highly prized by mountain families, and every piece sold brought them closer to their goal. The monthly reports to Marshal Garrett had become a source of quiet pride rather than obligation. Each letter detailed not just the money sent, but the lives they were building, the community they were serving, and the genuine relationships they had formed with people who had initially been suspicious of the newcomers. Mrs. Patterson wrote. Again, Abigail said, pulling a letter from her apron pocket. Her son's treatments are going well, and she wanted us to know that our contribution made the difference between hope and despair. Silas rose from the garden and climbed the porch steps to join her, his movements still carrying the easy strength of a man who had spent his life in harmony with the wilderness. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands settling protectively over their unborn child. Any word on when Marshal Garrett plans to visit? He asked, though his tone carried no anxiety. The marshal had kept his word about monthly check-ins, and his letters had grown progressively warmer as the evidence mounted that the McCoys were genuine in their efforts at restitution. Next month, Abigail replied, leaning back against her husband's solid warmth, but I think this might be the last official visit. His last letter suggested that the federal prosecutors are satisfied with our progress and willing to consider the matter resolved if we continue for the full year as promised. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the peaks that had witnessed their desperate wedding, and now stood guard over their growing contentment. Scout dozed in a patch of sunlight near the garden, graying, around the muzzle but still alert enough to chase off the occasional curious deer. In the months since that terrifying morning when the marshals had arrived, Abigail had discovered that love could grow even in the most unlikely soil. What had begun as a marriage of desperate convenience had deepened into something richer and more complex than either of them had dared hope for. They had learned to laugh together, to work in harmony, to find comfort in each other's presence during the long mountain nights. More importantly, they had learned to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. Sarah's memory had found its proper place in their lives, not as a barrier to new love, but as a testament to the possibility of deep connection between two people willing to commit to building something lasting together. "I've been thinking," Silas said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded his most important observations, "about the cradle." Abigail turned in his arms to face him, seeing something in his weathered features that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. "What about it?" "I want to start carving it next week," he said simply. "Been planning the design in my head, thinking about what our child might like to see when they wake up in the morning. Figured maybe some mountain scenes, a few forest animals, something that tells them where they come from." The casual reference to "our child" rather than "your child" or "the baby" sent warmth flooding through Abigail's chest. From the beginning, Silas had claimed the coming child as his own, never showing the slightest hesitation about raising another man's offspring, though they both knew the child was his in every way that mattered. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like them to know they belong to these mountains, to this life we've built." Silas nodded, his hands moving gently over her belly as if blessing the life growing there. "Been thinking about names, too. If it's a boy, maybe Samuel after my father. If it's a girl—" He paused, emotion making his voice rough. "If it's a girl, maybe Hope. Seems fitting, given how she came to us." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of the suggestion. Hope McCoy, a name that carried the promise of everything they had found together, everything they were building for the future. "Hope?" she repeated, tasting the sound of it. "Yes, that's perfect." As if responding to her parents' conversation, the baby moved within her, a gentle flutter that made them both smile. In that moment, standing on the porch of their mountain home, with the promise of new life between them and the ghost of old sorrows finally laid to rest, Abigail understood that she had found something she had never even known to look for. Not just love, though that had surprised her with its depth and constancy. Not just safety, though the mountain offered sanctuary beyond anything she had imagined. But belonging, the deep, soul-settling knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to share her life with. "I love you, Silas McCoy," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything they had survived together and everything they had yet to discover. "And I love you, Abigail McCoy," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of morning. Coffee and mountain air and the infinite possibility of days stretching ahead of them like an uncharted trail through beautiful, dangerous country that they would explore together. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, riding the warm thermals that rose from the sun-heated earth. Its cry echoed off the granite peaks, a wild sound that spoke of freedom and endurance and the eternal dance between survival and hope that defined life in the high country. And in the cabin below, two people who had learned to trust in second chances began planning for the future they would build with their own hands, one careful choice at a time.